Welcome to our study of Treasury of Precious Qualities, which is one of the great classics, really, within the tradition of the Great Perfection, the Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. And this is, of course, as you can imagine, rather a daunting task to be representing this text. At the same time, it would be sad if we didn't actually look at this. So many of us, we have connected with this particular lineage, this particular teaching. We might even have the book on our shelves. And so really what my intention with this workshop is really just to enable us all to make a connection with this particular teaching, with the lineage of Omniscient Jigme Lingpa. Also because this reaches us not just as, you could say, a heritage of something in the distant past, but very much as a living tradition that reaches us until the present day, with what we would generally refer to as actually re-embodiments of Jigme Lingpa teaching in this world at this time. So this is, like I said, this is one of the really great classics of, well, of Tibetan Buddhism in general, but of course, particularly within the tradition of what we call the Longchen Nyingtik, the heart essence of the vast expanse, and the Nyingma teaching in general. One thing, of course, that is always said when we engage in this kind of study is we should really recognize the relevance of what we are studying in terms of the suffering that we see everywhere around us. The very condition of samsara, the very condition that the Buddha set out to remedy, is not some strange mystical condition, but something really that we can see everywhere we look, at all times, everywhere. We can see individuals afflicted by this suffering that if we analyze, we can see goes back to a basic delusion, a lack of understanding, simply not understanding the nature of mind. And it's really from that perspective then that we engage in this kind of study. We have within the modern world a remarkable science that is essentially focused on what is material, but we should also recognize the science that we're studying here is equally valid, and we could say equally founded on the same epistemic premises, the same validation of what is knowledge, namely observation and critical thinking. The Buddha's teachings are not, as the Buddha himself pointed out, they're not approached or embraced on the basis of just respect for his person, but like the Buddha said in one famous sutra, the Kalama Sutta, where he said, "You should not accept my teaching out of faith in my person, but rather on the basis of your own inquiry." And just like you would not purchase gold without verifying its validity, you should not accept my words without analyzing what I'm teaching. And this is very important for us in the modern world, who are essentially, particularly within a modern context, brought up with a notion of critical thinking. And that's why we should appreciate that the Buddhist teaching is something that, of course, while we could say trust and faith is something that facilitates a spiritual transformation, the very foundation of the Buddha's insights, we should understand, are never founded on belief systems or metaphysical assumptions or cultural belief systems and so on, but very much founded on what we can verify. The thing about the Buddha's teaching is that where our modern science, it stops at what we could call the material, and where even consciousness in the modern context very often is understood as possibly just being material or biological systems. The Buddhist teaching is all about our consciousness and what essentially drives our experience. And why we study with the Buddha is because we would say the Buddha attained perfect enlightenment. And this also is not something that's normally understood within our modern context. The Buddha eliminated every kind of cognitive veil, every kind of cognitive dysfunction, every kind of, you could say, psychological limitation, and saw reality clearly. Of course, within Buddhist jargon, we have a lot of language that speaks about how we define this, but essentially we would say what we mean with Buddha is somebody that has eliminated all confusion and brought about the flourishing of a natural, innate abiding potential for awakening. And so that's where the Buddha's teaching is not just about what we can observe, what we perceive as a hard external reality, but actually understands how it's the presence of our subjective confusion that actually constructs a particular reality. And the Buddha discovered in the absence of that projection and this confusion, there's actually a freedom in which all the qualities that we innately and intuitively appreciate become manifest. And so in that way, the Buddhist teaching, it goes into an awareness of, you could say, two phenomenologies or two ways of understanding our reality. One is the reality in which we are caught, what we then call samsara, and then the reality of someone that is completely awake, completely free from any delusion. And so we have these two realities. One, you could say, is of confusion or delusion, and one is of awakening. And the Buddha saw that this condition of awakening is innate to all life. The Buddha never saw himself as somebody superior, but rather as someone who discovered how sentient beings unnecessarily are caught in a condition of suffering. And so that's where then the Buddha proceeded to teach. So the teaching that we have that comes down from the Buddha is essentially a science that understands how confusion comes about and how it can be eliminated. And from the Buddha down into the present day, then we have a continuity of remarkable individuals who have manifested in this world and presented what the Buddha taught, not as a gesture of, you could say, dogmatic adherence and subscription to what the Buddha taught, but rather you could say a continual process of discovering the validity of what the Buddha had taught. And we actually, from the Buddha down until the present day, for 2,500 years, we have then a tradition or lineage, a living, you could say, heritage of individuals that have fully recognized what the Buddha taught. And so us engaging in this study, we're not engaging into something that is particularly Buddhist or particularly foreign in any way. It is something that touches on the reality that we experience, but very much with the understanding that there's a condition of suffering that we unnecessarily are caught by and which can be remedied. So I say this because when we are going to engage in this study, it actually involves a whole different way of seeing our experience. And the initial section of the book is very much about us recognizing the extraordinary opportunity we presently have with an understanding of the essentially difficult and suffering condition of samsara, with the intention that we can free ourselves. Then, of course, the teaching is presenting the particular, you could say, pathology of samsara, the particular condition in which we find ourselves suffering in samsara. And there's quite a lot of detail around that. There's, however, a very empowered position that says this is how samsara can play out, but presently we have an opportunity to remedy this. And so the intention behind the entire teaching is really understanding the suffering, where the suffering comes from, understanding that the causes of suffering is removable, and then proceeding with, you could say, the proactive measures with which we then can eliminate the causes of samsara and uncover this innate disposition of awakening that is innate to all life. So in that we understand the relevance of what we're presently studying here, we undertake this study very much with an awareness that we live in a world in which there's so much confusion and so much suffering, essentially on account of not knowing what to do. All sentient beings wishing to be happy and yet proceeding to perpetuate their own suffering. We can understand that this situation of samsara really comes from a place in which sentient beings everywhere are innocent and yet not knowing really what to do, perpetuate and create their own suffering. So the study that we're undertaking here very much is intending to remedy this situation. So, so we're going to be then looking at this work. I'm going to include the forewords, which I think are very helpful. And also, as I was preparing the material today and actually looking at some the life stories of both Jigme Lingpa and Kangyur Rinpoche, I actually I had overlooked that actually that is presented within the foreword. So we'll be covering that. But we'll start with the foreword by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So His Holiness writes, the view of the great perfection, Dzogchen, is difficult and profound. The main texts that explain it are Longchen Ramjampa's Treasury of the Supreme Vehicle, which is itself quite difficult, and the Treasury of the Expanse of Reality. It is my advice that people who are interested in the Nyingma path in general and the Great Perfection teachings in particular should study Rinpoche Jigme Lingpa's more accessible Treasury of Precious Qualities. Now, those of you who've been following Woolston's study of finding rest in the nature of mind will probably remember at one place, Woolston says His Holiness Dalai Lama commented to Khyentse Rinpoche that he found Longchen Rabjam's writings not that easy. And Khyentse Rinpoche reassured him that that would come with experience, the ability to understand them. But anyway, you could say that the teachings that we have from Longchen Rabjam in finding rest in the nature of mind, and also in generally in the 7 treasuries, they are to some extent summarized within these 2 volumes then of the Treasury of Precious Qualities. Anyway, my objective with this particular study really is just to study volume 1, and this is somewhat consistent with what we studied in Finding Rest in the Nature of the Mind. And what we have here also is some substantial commentary from the translators here. So His Holiness then continues, the work translated here is the first volume of a commentary to that book by Kangyur Rinpoche, Longchen Yeshe Dorje. The Treasury of Precious Qualities is a text belonging to the stages of the path, Lamrim, of the path genre that covers all the stages up to the path of the path to enlightenment according to the Nyingma tradition, up to and including the teachings of Dzogchen. The present volume covers the sutra section that presents a detailed exposition of the path from the perspective of the 3 kinds of beings classified according to their aspirations. So these 3 kinds of beings are what we refer to those who wish simply a higher rebirth, those who wish to be free from sufferings of samsara, and those who wish to establish all sentient beings in freedom from samsara. So His Holiness comments then, it opens with an account of the 4 thoughts that turn the mind toward the Dharma. the nature of the cycle of existence, the Four Noble Truths, and the 12 links of dependent arising. On this basis, it explains how to take refuge in the Buddha, his teaching, and the spiritual community, the significance of doing so, and how to generate within oneself the awakening mind of bodhicitta. The presentation of the 6 perfections, generosity, ethics, patience, effort, meditation, and wisdom, includes a discussion of the 3 vows, the vow of individual emancipation, the Bodhisattva vow, and the Tantric vow, as a guide to conduct, and an exposition of the middle way, Madhyamika, as a guide to the correct view. Thorough and complete in every way, this commentary is comprehensive, fairly brief, and easy to read. I believe the members of the Padmakara translation group have taken great pains to render a clear, accessible English translation that readers will find illuminating. I pray that they will take great inspiration from it in their own practice of the path to enlightenment. So this is then, I think, Jigme Rinpoche's forward. So Rinpoche writes, the Treasury of Precious Qualities by Omniscient Jigme Lingpa and the commentary on it composed by Kangyur Rinpoche are the works of genuine masters who are utterly free from the concerns of this world and the desire for wealth and renown. The great value of these texts lie in the fact that they present the Buddha Dharma in a way that is truly grounded in the words of the Buddha himself. Their lineage is pure and their teachings are authentic. It is amazing that these teachings still exist. They arose solely thanks to the unspeakable kindness of the Buddha, Shakyamuni, the source of the tradition, without whom neither the Dharma that we study and practice nor the Sangha to which we think we belong would exist. These teachings were brought to Tibet and preserved for us through the enlightened power of Padmasambhava, the lake-born guru, through the learning and authority of the Bodhisattva abbot, Shantarakshita, and through the protective, nurturing patronage of the Dharma king, Trison Detsen. So these 3 together then we refer to as the Acharya, the king, and the abbot, Khenlop Chuson. So these are seen as really the founding fathers of Tibetan Buddhism. So Rinpoche continued, it is mainly thanks to their sublime compassion and the compassion of those who follow them, the 25 great disciples of Guru Rinpoche, the Indian Panditas, and the Tibetan translators, together with all the other masters of the lineage, that we can still receive the teachings of the Buddha and put them into practice. Kyabji Kangyur Rinpoche's commentary on the Treasury of Precious Qualities, translated here, is a distillation and a key to the vast array of teachings that the great beings of Tibet and India have set forth and brought to fruition. It is really an indispensable and trustworthy guide to anyone who has even the slightest interest in Buddhism. For it expounds what the Dharma actually is. It throws light upon our lives, on where we stand and on our practice. For those who read it, may it prove a rich treasure of genuine information and a constant source of inspiration and encouragement. So then the introduction from the translators. The Treasury of Precious Qualities by Omniscient Jigme Lingpa, who lived from 1730 to 1798, presents in a slender volume of elegant verses the entire Buddhist path according to the Nyingma or ancient school of Tibetan Buddhism. It is structured gradually and shows how all the Buddha's teachings, from the basic essentials to the most advanced practices of the great perfection, converge without contradiction into a single path to enlightenment. It is universally respected text and is studied in all Nyingma establishments, usually as a completing summary of the long course of advanced study. The first 9 chapters, which expound the sutra teachings of both the Hinayana and Mahayana paths, are translated here, together with a detailed commentary by the 20th century master, Kangyur Rinpoche. It is an indispensable manual for those drawn to the Nyingma teachings. So then, so now here we then have something about Jigme Lingpa's life. And I'm probably going to be going over the footnotes. They seem to be quite helpful and in general quite substantial. So this account is adapted from the biography of Jigme Lingpa. See also Masters of Meditation and Miracles by Tuku Tundup. Yeah, by the way, what I have done is, so all of you who are here, you would have received an email where there's also a link to the recordings of these sessions here, both video and audio. And also there's a folder with resource material, and I've uploaded the chapter from Nyushu Ken Rinpoche with Kangyur Rinpoche's life story, and then also the life story from Masters of Miracles and Meditations that are just being mentioned here from Tuku Tundup. Okay, somebody says, I haven't received the link you're referring to. Okay, then please email me. Now, I would just like to point out that if you have registered, you must have received an email, and in that same email, you do have the links to the Dropbox folder in which the recordings will be. Yeah. So I'm almost assuming that you might have it, but then again, by some incredible, maybe some friends sent you this link without the email. Yeah, you might want to check your email again. Anyway, that is quite common. It's all in the same email. So, Jigme Lingpa, although he came to be regarded as one of the most important figures in the Nyingma lineage and an incarnation of both the great master Vimla Mitra and Dharma King Trisong Detsen, Jigme Lingpa was born and grew up in a situation of simple obscurity. At the age of 6, he was placed in the monastery of Palri in South Tibet, where after taking the vows of preliminary ordination, he imbibed a basic monastic education. 7 years later, at the age of 13, he met his teacher, the great Tertön Ringzin Tukchok Dorje, from whom he received many transmissions and instructions. His youth was marked by unusual spiritual precocity and visions of Guru Padmasambhava, the Dakini Yeshe Tsogil, and other enlightened beings. And other enlightened beings became a regular feature of his experience. A visionary encounter with Manjushu Mitra, one of the patriarchs of the Dzogchen lineage, proved a turning point in his life, and he decided to lay aside his monastic robe in preference for the white shawl and the long hair of a yogi. He was temperamentally drawn to a life of solitary practice and, while still a young man, completed 2-year retreats. In the course of the first, he became a Tertön, a discovery of hidden Dharma treasures, and he revealed the important cycle of teachings and practices known as Longchen Nyingtik. Let's see what they have to say about that. A full description of this discovery can be found in The Wish-Fulfilling Jewel by Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. So, yeah, warmly recommended. It was, however, during his second retreat, which he began at the age of 31 at Samye Chimpu, that his most profound experiences began to manifest. For it was then that he directly beheld the great master Longchen Rabjam in 3 successive visions. In the first, he received the transmission of the entire range of Longchenpa's teachings. In the second, he was granted the authorization to uphold and propagate them. And finally, in the course of the third visions, the minds of the 2 masters mingled ineffably, so that the realization of Longchenpa arose instantaneously in the mind of Jigme Lingpa. So we sometimes speak about these 3 visions in terms of the first being blessed by Longchenpa's body, the second by his speech, and then third by his mind. The 2 masters, historically separated by 5 centuries, became henceforth identical in terms of knowledge and accomplishment. Later, after concluding his second retreat, Jigme Lingpa began to expound, now 7 years after its discovery, his Dharma treasure, the Longchen Nyingtik, transmitting it to his close disciples, Jigme Trünle Özer, the first Dorupchen Rinpoche, and Jigme Jewe Nyugo, who passed it on to his disciple Paltro Rinpoche. The Longchen Nyingtik subsequently spread throughout Tibet and remains to this day one of the most important systems of meditative and yogic practice in the Nyingma school. The latter part of Jigme Lingpa's life was spent at Tseringjeong, a small hermitage and meditation center which he founded in the south of Tibet. He lived there in great simplicity, receiving and instructing his many disciples and using the gifts of patrons in all sorts of compassionate and religious activities. It was, for instance, his long-lived habit to save the lives of animals by buying them from butchers and hunters and setting them free. His life, in short, was that of a great bodhisattva, the personification of the qualities and ideals described in the scriptures and set forth in his own writings. He composed an autobiography in which we may catch a glimpse of a warm, affectionate character, clear-sighted, utterly fearless, and without guile, marked by compassion and clarity of supreme attainment. So quoting Jigme Lingpa himself, my perceptions have become like those of a little boy, and I take pleasure in playing with children. But when I come across people with important faults of character, I don't hesitate to confront them directly with their shortcomings, even if they are important religious leaders or generous sponsors. Whatever I'm doing, whether sitting still or walking around, whether eating or sleeping, my mind is in a state that is never separate from the clarity of the ultimate nature. In whatever I do for the Dharma, I pledge myself to complete it, however impossible it may seem. Simple as his lifestyle may have been, Jigme Lingpa was nevertheless a scholar of prodigious learning. It is said that he was born wise, with an understanding and a capacity to assimilate the teachings without much need for study. As he himself said, it was profound visionary experience rather than intellectual application that released the immense flood of knowledge latent in the nature of his mind, with the result that the impounded waters of his wisdom burst forth from within. He compiled the 25-volume collection of the Nyingma Tantras and composed a history of them, and at his death he left behind 9 volumes of original treatises and discovered treasure texts. Of these, the Longininti collection is certainly the most important and well-known, while the Treasury of Precious Qualities, together with the 2-volume auto-commentary, is his most celebrated work of scholarship. So link to the Dropbox is on the study page under this teaching section. That's right. The webinar organizer email confirmations of registration do not contain any of, that's right. Yes, they don't contain that. That's just for the webinar. That's correct, yeah. You have to refer to that initial email. It was an email of the 18th of November, thank you. Is there interface between the two realities, Buddhas and ordinary beings? If there is, what is that? Thank you. That's actually a very good question. Yes, the interface is our mind. See, presently we experience the condition of confusion, but this is essentially a delusion that simply veils our true nature, which is underlying. At the same time, we can't bypass this present experience that we have. And therefore, in the Buddhist teaching, there's the skill of the Buddhist teaching is actually that it accommodates our confusion. And this is what we refer to as the skillful means, or sometimes the expedient nature of the Buddha's teachings. And that's why the Buddha's teachings begin with first identifying the condition of suffering, but then understanding where the suffering comes from and understanding that the suffering is removable. Then we proceed to eliminating the causes of confusion, which then result in uncovering this abiding reality, which is, you could say, the core of our being. So all that boils down to, practically speaking, the practice of the path. So while we can understand the theory, then the actual process that facilitates this experience practically is then the Buddha's path practice. So the text itself. So then in regards to then engaging this path, then we need to first have an understanding that you could say informs what we're doing. So that's where then we say the Treasury of Precious Qualities consists of 2 main sections devoted respectively to the sutras and the tantras. The sutra section of the root text and commentary contained in the present volume covers the ethical, psychological, and philosophical teachings which are embodied in the Tripitaka and shared by all schools of Tibetan Buddhism. The essential thrust is toward the Mahayana, but the text naturally subsumes and exhaustively covers questions more associated with the Hinayana perspective, such as the fundamental issues of karma and ethics, the Four Noble Truths, and the 12-fold chain of dependent arising. And it is noteworthy that considerable attention is given to the subject of the pratimoksha, or the vows of individual liberation, which, as the commentary itself explains, was not discussed at length in Gyalwa Longchenpa's own work, The Great Chariot, to which the Treasury of Precious Qualities may, in this respect, be regarded as a supplement. So here we have completed if not the study of the Great Chariot, then the root text of the Great Chariot, which is then finding rest in the nature of the mind. And so here we're going to be looking at, within this context of the sutra teachings, we're going to be looking at particularly that which applies to the present condition that we find ourselves, which is inhabitants of what appears to us to be a very real world with a very real condition of a mind that needs to be purified of confusion. And so the sutra teachings is very important for us, particularly in the modern world, where we like to have rational understanding and properly really having a ground and a context to understand what it is that we're doing. This is part of, you could say, the way that we're brought up with this analytical bent, this critical thinking, and that's where the sutra teachings accommodates this in terms of pointing out the nature of suffering and how it can be remedied by the various aspects of the path. And the Buddha and the sutra teachings are quite important because they really give us, on one hand, an understanding of the condition of suffering, but also, with the understanding of where it comes from, a vision of what reality actually is and how we could approach reality, how we can understand it, and in terms of our own analysis. And again, this is validated through the teachings on what we can call pramana, or valid cognition, that actually establish why we would accept these teachings as truth. And this is where you could say there's a common premise between what we in the modern world respect as the natural sciences, which is really observation, observing what we can directly perceive, and what we can't directly perceive, we can operate with inference and logic. And in this way, the approach of the sutra teachings accommodate really the present experience that we have. So we would say the sutra teachings is what addresses our experience as individuals, applying, or the way that we experience the world through our ordinary mind. Of course, what is a challenge for the modern person is that the expedient teachings continually refer to a worldview that very often is grounded in a very different cosmology. And that's where it's important for us, when we approach the Buddhist teaching, to not all of a sudden say, well, these teachings, they're grounded in a different culture, they're not relevant for us. Because of course, while there's some of the references that are culturally bound, for example, the cosmology in terms of Mount Meru in the center and the continents and so forth, then the main thrust of the teaching really has to do with understanding our consciousness. And that's where the insight into how our consciousness is capable of creating both the condition of samsara and also how this condition can be eliminated and give way to an uncovering of the nature of enlightenment. This all goes through an understanding that is universal and that is relevant, and that we can assess from our own, you could say, inquiry. So this present volume that we're going to be looking at then comes from the addresses, or aims at summarizing then the teachings that were just mentioned here. The second volume is then more about the Vajrayana teaching. So here we have Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo. So Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo was seen as an incarnation of Jigme Lingpa, and as it says here, one of the principal founders of the Rime or non-sectarian movement. He was one of the main holders of the lineage of the Treasury of Precious Qualities, through whom the transmission was passed down to Kangyur Rinpoche. And as we'll see in Kangyur Rinpoche's life then, the lineage then was passed down from Khyentse Wangpo, I think, to his teacher, Jedung Chinle Jampa Jongna. So the translators, they continue here. It says, in the manner of most Buddha's root texts, the Treasury of Precious Qualities is comprehensive but concise, a distillation, in fact, that is practically impenetrable to all but experts already seasoned in the Buddhist teaching. It is, moreover, composed in verse and makes use of elaborate poetic language, rich in metaphor. A commentary is indispensable. And in addition to Jigme Lingpa's own exposition, several have been composed over the last 2 centuries. Traditionally, scriptures and religious texts may be explained in different ways, thus giving rise to a variety of commentarial styles. A chidrel, or general commentary, gives a comprehensive overview of the text. A dundrel, or meaning commentary, expounds and discusses the text's essential meaning and purpose. By contrast, the chendrel and the tsikdrel, respectively a commentary in the form of footnotes and a commentary of every word, painstakingly gloss the actual wording of the original. In the first case, partially, and in the second case, entirely. In both chendrel and tsikdrel, the words of the original work are woven into the text of the commentary, where they are indicated in the Tibetan by small circles placed beneath the letters, the words being interpreted briefly at length or not at all, as the case may be. Finally, there exists a kind of commentary known as kane, the purpose of which is to elucidate only difficult or controversial points. The size of these commentaries varies a great deal, ranging from full-length treatises to concise guides, the latter being virtually memory aids for readers already well-versed in the material. As already said, Jigme Lingpa produced a lengthy 2-volume meaning commentary of his own, namely the 2 chariots or Shinta Namni. This, of course, must remain the ultimate reference, but it is well known for being as difficult as it is profound. Jigme Lingpa's disciple Dorje Chinle Wurzer, who lived from 1745 to 1821, wrote a shorter commentary, as did the latter's Gelugpa disciple Alak Sopo Ngawang Tenda, born 1759. Some of you might have received the loan for this recently when Shichen Rabchen Rinpoche was giving some reading transmissions. Paltro Rinpoche, Ujin Chigi Wangpo, who lived from 1808 to 1887, composed a guide for teaching the Treasury of Precious Qualities, as well as several outlines and clarifications of difficult points. Later, around the turn of the 20th century, Khenpo Yönten Gyamso, belonging to Gemang, a branch of Dzogchen Monastery, composed an exhaustive, accessible, and very popular commentary in 2 works, Dawe Dreme, The Lamp of the Moon, and Nyime Wurzer, Refulgence of the Moon. And this also, and Khenpo Yönten Gyamso also being a student of Jamgon Miba Rinpoche. So, personally then, I had the fortune to receive the reading transmission of the root text from Kyabje Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. And then also there was an occasion during some retreat in France, actually, where Matthew Ricard, he stayed for several months and went over this text that, rather actually went over this text just referred to here, Khenpo Yönten Gyatso, Khenpo Yönga's text, which I had the fortune then to attend. So then the translators continue. The text that we have chosen for translation is the single volume commentary, the quintessence of the 3 paths, Texum Ninku, by Kyabje Kangyur Rinpoche, Longchen Yeshe Dorje. So this is found in Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche's collected writings, volume 16, volume Ma. Although this is itself a mighty tome of 600 pages, it is comparatively short, similar in size to the commentaries of the first Dorje Rinpoche and Alak Sopo Ngawang Tenda. The essence of Kangyur Rinpoche's work consists of footnotes to the Treasury of Precious Qualities, which he composed with reference to the studies he had made earlier at the feet of his principal teacher, Jedong Chinle Jampa Jungne of Rinpoche, who lived from 1856 to 1922. The text was completed in 1983 by Kyabje Dilgukhan Rinpoche, who lived from 1910 to 1991, who wrote the introductory verses and the conclusion. Jedong Rinpoche himself received the transmission of the Treasury of Precious Qualities from Jaren Khenze Wangpo, who received it in turn from Jigme Lingpa's disciple Jigme Nyugo. Kangyur Rinpoche also studied the text with his uncle, Khenpo Dawu Shenu, an abbot of Katok Monastery, whose transmission lineage is traced through the first Drupchen Rinpoche, Gyase Shenpen Paltro Rinpoche, Ujin Tenzin Nobo, and the Khenpos Yönten Gyaltso and Samten Gyaltso. While covering the whole of Jigme Lingpa's text, this commentary focuses on certain specific aspects, which it explains in detail. On the whole, it presupposes that the reader is already familiar with the whole range of scholastic terms and categories belonging to the Abhidharma literature, as well as with the broad sweep of the Sutra and Tantra teachings. As we have already said, the Treasury of Precious Qualities is often expounded at the end of a comprehensive course of study as a kind of concluding recapitulation in which many essential details are mentioned only briefly and in passing, it being assumed that the reader is already conversant with them. For this reason, Kangyur Rinpoche's commentary as it stands is in many places probably beyond the reach of the kind of reader for whom this translation is intended, namely Western Buddhists eager to enlarge and deepen their understanding of the Dharma. As a solution to this problem, it seems desirable to supply, as much as possible, the elements necessary for a ready understanding of the commentary without the need for extensive research in other books, some of which are, in any case, still unavailable in translation. We have therefore supplied lengthy notes and a series of appendixes, borrowing freely from the Kinjuk, Ju Mirpam Rinpoche, and the commentary of Khenpo Yönten Gyaltso mentioned above, and the Dumsum of Kyabje Dunjun Rinpoche. We hope that this will facilitate the reader's appreciation of Kangyur Rinpoche's commentary, which, while of manageable size, is in itself an inestimable mine of precious instruction. So this is where, in the case of this particular study, we'll stop at all the various footnotes and look in the various appendixes and so forth. So we're very indebted to the translators for having supplied all of this. So with regards to Kyabje Kangyur Rinpoche, Longchen Yeshe Dorje then, who has written the commentary we'll be looking at, here it says, aside from the merely practical considerations of brevity and accessibility, there are deeper, more personal reasons for working on this commentary and attempting to share it with others, namely, that its author was and remains one of the most significant sources of inspiration for the transmission of Buddha Dharma to the West. As recorded in a devotional poem by Dilgukhan Rinpoche, Kangyur Rinpoche, who lived from 1897 to 1975, was born in Kham in the east of Tibet and, like Jigme Lingpa before him, exhibited astonishing spiritual qualities and abilities even from his earliest childhood. While still very young, he met and delighted the heart of Mirpam Rinpoche, who was renowned as being Manjushri himself. In due course, he entered the monastery of Rinpoche, where he was accepted by his root guru, the incomparable Tatun, Jedong Rinpoche, Chinle Jampa Jongna. Rinpoche was an important center of the Rime, or non-sectarian tradition, and comprised two main colleges, one belonging to the Nyingma tradition and one to the tradition of the Taklung Kaji. Kangyur Rinpoche studied there for many years, eventually occupying the position of Vajra Master. So I'd like to say, please do look at, of course, here we have quite an abbreviated summary of Kangyur Rinpoche's life, but for some reason, I had never actually read Nyoshu Khenpo's life story of Kangyur Rinpoche, and very interesting. It's pretty much 3 full pages, and very, very interesting. So warmly recommended. You can find it up in the resources folder in the Dropbox. So then the translators continue. In due course, he withdrew from the monastery and the positions of importance that he held there and took up the life of a wandering hermit, living in mountain caves and visiting places of pilgrimage all over Tibet and the Himalayan region. In every sense, following in the footsteps of Paltro Rinpoche, the author of Words of My Perfect Teacher, in whose tradition he is obviously to be located. To magisterial learning was thus added many years of meditative retreat and yogic practice, resulting in supreme accomplishment. Many stories are told about him, of his meditative experience, his visit to hidden lands, and his discovery of Dharma treasures. Once, for example, while on pilgrimage to Lhasa, he went to visit and pay his respects to the great monastic university of Sera. While he was there, he was challenged to debate by some of the monks, avid to test their dialectical skills on an unknown newcomer. Accepting the challenge, Kangyur Rinpoche acquitted himself with such brilliance, defeating more than 10 geshes in succession, that the word went round that he must be a manifestation of Je Tsongkhapa himself, who is said to pay anonymous visits to his disciples from time to time in order to check the quality of their debate. Kangyur Rinpoche was, as we have just indicated, a Tertun, a revealer of Dharma treasures, and was regarded as an emanation of Namkhen Rinpo, one of the foremost disciples of Guru Padmasambhava, the Indian master who established Buddhism in Tibet in the 8th century. In the course of his life, Kangyur Rinpoche experienced pure visions of many great masters of the past: Vimalamitra, So Yeshe Wangchu, Taksham Samten Lingpa, and others, from whom he received numerous teachings and transmissions, becoming thus the holder of many rare and prized short lineages. A notable feature of his innumerable activities was the reading transmission of the Kangyur, the canon of Buddhist scriptures consisting of over 100 volumes. And it was from the fact that he completed this immense undertaking no fewer than 24 times that the name Kangyur Rinpoche came to be applied to him. Actually, in Nyosho Khenpo's life story, it says that having been blessed by a vision of Manjushri, Kangyur Rinpoche was able to read 6 volumes of the Kangyur every day, which is just an extraordinary, astonishing feat. These are huge volumes. So here we have an image of Jedrung Rinpoche, Tuna Jampa Jungna, who lived from 1856 to 1922, a disciple of Jamgon Khyentse Wangpo and the root teacher of Kangyur Rinpoche. He presided over the monastery of Kam Rinpoche, with traditions of both the ancient translation school and that of Taklung Kagyu were taught and practiced. He was a celebrated Tertun, or revealer of treasure teachings. It was from him that Kangyur Rinpoche received the transmission of the Treasury of Precious Qualities. Foreseeing the disaster to come, he, meaning Kangyur Rinpoche, left Tibet sometime before 1959 and traveled to India with a large collection of books and precious manuscripts, thereby preserving many texts which would otherwise have been lost forever. He eventually settled in Darjeeling with his family and founded a monastery there. It was here in the late 60s and early 70s that he encountered the spiritual aspirations of Westerners and was one of the first Tibetan masters to accept them as disciples. And also here I should insert, there has recently been, there was a movie that was completed very much from the point of view of one of the Western students, in this case a student from New Zealand who studied with Kangyur Rinpoche in the 1970s and then returned to visit the monastery again only a few years ago. The movie is called Return to Gandhi Road, warmly recommended, both from the point of view of sort of reflecting this interesting moment of history in which Westerners met with great Tibetan masters like Kangyur Rinpoche, but also specifically, actually, a lot of very interesting detail about Kangyur Rinpoche's life and interviews with his family and so on. Also, some of his Western students. Return to Gandhi Road. Then it continues thus: while the destruction of Tibet continued apace, Kangyur Rinpoche labored not only for the preservation of the Dharma in exile, but with great kindness laid the foundations for its propagation in Western lands. Willing as he may have been to accept Westerners as his students, Kangyur Rinpoche's approach was always profoundly traditional and it was his wish that his disciples should be trained as far as they were able and without shortcuts in all the successive stages of the path. He never in fact traveled to the west, but after his death and in accordance with his wishes, his eldest son, Taklung Tsetru Rinpoche, Pema Wangyal, came to France, soon to be followed by the rest of his family, and established several traditional 3-year retreat centers in Dordogne. Here, a sizable number of Western students have had the good fortune to practice according to the Nyingma tradition, receiving instructions and transmissions from such great masters as Dungyom Rinpoche, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, Drupchen Rinpoche, and Yoshu Ken Rinpoche. Subsequently, some of the students who had completed long retreats began to work on making Buddhist texts available in translation. It was thus that the Padmakara translation group came into being, the natural outcome of the original impetus set in motion by Kangyur Rinpoche, who, as its first and abiding inspiration, may be regarded in every sense as its founding father. To make his work available in English and other languages is an attempt to repay in some measure our debt of gratitude, as well as to be of some service to the Western Buddhist community. May I ask, return to where? So it's a movie about a Western student that studied with Kangyur Rinpoche. So it documents the journey of the student, but also a lot of detail around Kangyur Rinpoche himself. So the movie is called Return to Gandhi Road. So it's I think it is, if you Google it, I think it's actually available now online. In covering the general sweep of sutra teachings, this commentary naturally contains a wealth of technical vocabulary covering not only the metaphysical, psychological, and epistemological categories of the Abhidharma, but also of the Prajnaparamita Sutras and the philosophical teachings of the 4 Buddhist tenet systems, particularly that of the Madhyamika. This has implied a certain amount of research and a good deal of inventiveness on the part of the translators, who have gratefully adopted the terminology already used by other translators as this came to hand and seemed appropriate. Nevertheless, the fact that so much Buddhist literature in English has appeared in recent years should not be allowed to conceal the fact that the translation of Buddhist texts into Western languages is still in its infancy, and that it is vain to suppose that we are anywhere near establishing a universally accepted or acceptable vocabulary in translation. This is the unfortunate consequence of translating into a language that is closely associated with a specific culture equipped with its own native non-Buddhist philosophical and religious tradition. English, rich in synonyms as it may be, and patient of accretion from other languages, does not yet possess a generally accepted vocabulary able to express with ease the subtleties of Buddhist psychology and metaphysics. In the present case, the translators were often at a loss to find the right word, and frequently frequently been called upon to press words into service for which they were not originally conceived, with the inevitable consequence that often ill-sounding approximations. Examples of this abound. One need only consider such basic terms as merit, emotion, monk, compassion, patience, nature, and essence to appreciate the difficulty. However, we hope that the present work will contribute usefully to a future and more perfect translation of the Buddhist sutra teachings into English. The names of the scriptures cited in the commentary pose something of a problem. For obvious reasons, it was desirable to refer to them by their Sanskrit titles. In the case of the sutras and shastras, this was not difficult, since the titles of these texts are easy to find, in, for instance, the indexes of the Kangyur and Tengyur published by Tatang Rinpoche. The situation was different in the case of the Tantras. With the exception of well-known texts like the Guhya Garbha, Guhya Samaj, and Kalachakra, the names of which are given in Sanskrit, most of the Tantras referred to were difficult for us to locate. Therefore, rather than hazard a translation of our own, we decided to preserve a clear reference by leaving titles in Tibetan. Okay, so this is a very modest introduction here, highlighting the difficulties of the text and the challenge. And of course, it applies that, again, like I was touching on earlier on, within the modern context, we have a remarkable rich vocabulary, language, civilization, science, etc., that carries its own particular, you could say, worldview, which in many cases is, in so many cases is, you could say, makes it difficult for us to take in the perspectives of other traditions. And that's where very often there is there's certainly terms which, like was pointed out here, already have their own particular meaning within our particular cultural context. And yet, because this needs to be translated, then we might use these, and like the examples were given there before, such as the words merit and so on, even the words enlightenment and so on, of course, speaks about something that's entirely unknown within our culture. Enlightenment in the Western context has a very different meaning from enlightenment in a Buddhist context. And so not only linguistically, but also in terms of, you could say, the actual vision and experience as such is an unknown. And that's where we, in approaching this, have to take into consideration the limitations of the situation. And at the same time, it is imperative really that we engage in this simply from the point of view that this is beyond any doubt the most important science there could ever be, namely to uncover what is the natural potential of all life, the natural innate disposition of enlightenment that abides intrinsically in all sentient beings and which remains concealed. And that is where we look to the Buddha as the fully enlightened one, somebody who penetrated to truth, to actually uncover this disposition, and who actually, through his teaching, then points us to this abiding innate potential. So, so in that sense, if we really wish to get to the bottom of what is the cause of suffering, unveil the natural, you could say, potential of all life, then we would say that is the premise of the Buddhist teaching. So there could be, you could say, not a science that's more valuable and important. So I hope everybody engaging in this particular study have the patience to really hear out what is being presented here. And I would also like to say that the Padmakara translation group, as modest as they might be, do a remarkable work really in their translations. I think everybody's pretty aware of that, so I needn't elaborate further. So, yes, the Return to Gandhi Road is available. In fact, it's called returntogandhiroad.com. So it's already out. You can rent it there on YouTube for a small fee. Okay. So good. Thank you very much. And actually, I failed to begin with. I was going to insist that we begin these studies with actually a supplication to Jigme Lingpa. I forgot that. But anyway, we can do that now and then also dedicate in conclusion. So, invoking Jigme Lingpa, the source of love and compassion for all beings, who knows all that is knowable, emanation of Longchenpa, heir to a treasury of mind termas, sky-like yogin of the vast expanse of luminosity, Jigme Lingpa, at your feet we pray. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we are born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. by this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Okay. So thank you very much for joining us here for this study, and see you again next Sunday. Thank you.